What are some of the ways in which you can reduce the impact of what you buy on the environment? Well, let's see now. There's the rise of reusable pads and menstrual cups that make your period plastic-free. There's the option of retaining the glass containers your cosmetics come in to repurpose them into something cute at home. There's biodegradable, waste-free options for your laundry detergent, your window cleaner, and even the paper you wrap your leftovers in. But if you've been paying attention, you'll notice that nearly all of these products are targeted towards a single consumer group: women. Why, you ask? Well, according to a 2018 report by Minto, a senior consumer lifestyles analyst, Jack Duckett, confirmed what many of us may already know to be true: that women are still in charge of running the household. That means laundry, cleaning, and recycling often falls under their share of work. And whilst it is true that women are powerful consumers to attract, there is the very real issue of eco-friendly campaigns aimed at women, relaying the message that caring for our planet is women's work. There's also evidence that suggests that femininity and quote-unquote greenness have come to be cognitively linked. This in turn partly puts off men from doing their bit, such as carrying a reusable shopping bag, recycling, or even being a vegetarian/vegan for fear of being perceived as gay or effeminate. In this episode, we talk about the links between masculinity and sustainability, the eco-gender gap as it has now come to be known, and how green branding can stop being so pink. Welcome to this week's episode on Amplified. Today's guest is Isaias Hernandez, also known as on his social media channels as the Queer Brown Vegan. Isaias is the creator of Queer Brown Vegan, where he makes accessible environmental education content. He seeks to provide a safe space for other like-minded environmentalists to engage in the discourse of the current climate crisis. He is also the co-creator of an environmental magazine called Alluvia that highlights BIPOC environmentalists through climate justice storytelling. If you head over to his social media, you will find a wealth of resources on different aspects of climate change, how BIPOC communities are affected by it, and what you can do to make change. And I'm very, very excited to have him take time out for this very early on in the morning, all the way from New York. And I'm so glad you're here, Isaias. Thank you so much for being on my podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much again for inviting me to speak on your podcast. I'm very excited to be able to share my experiences and also get to know about what you do.
Yeah, sure. That sounds great. So first of all, let's talk about you. Let's talk about Queer Brown Vegan, the platform. And I want to know what inspired you to become an educator and to start this platform.
Yeah, definitely. I think for me, I've always had a passion for environmentalism at such a young age. My community experienced a lot of several environmental injustices growing up. I didn't really make the interconnections between the environment and my health and my community. And I think it was only until once I had the privilege to be able to attend university that I started learning a lot of the language and the academic sciences behind environmental justice and environmental racism. And it really spurred interest into what I really wanted to do. And I think for me, I've always been someone that's a very visual learner and wanting to really make things simple for others. And my curiosity for environmentalism spurred through there, and it flourished throughout college. And I think for me, creating Queer Brown Vegan was because a lot of my friends were always telling me, why aren't you doing motivational speaking? Why aren't you coaching? Why aren't you talking about environmentalism? I feel that people would be able to connect with you in some way. And I felt like my voice wasn't really needed during the time. And I told myself oh no, it's okay. But I think I then realized myself that why don't I just share this information, and who cares if no one doesn't really find it valuable? And if I find it valuable, at the end of the day, I get to practice my writing literacy, reading, research skills to go to grad school in the future. And sort of like that, I kind of became this person on Instagram that kind of, did research on a lot of things. And now people always go up to me for a lot of environmental education questions.
Yeah. And You talked a little bit about your own community, and I think it's important that we point out to the listeners here that you are a Mexican American.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering, what were the sort of ideas or conversations you were exposed to on sustainability while you were growing up in the US, but with a very sort of strong background in Mexican culture and heritage?
Yeah, definitely. I think for ourselves mainly, I think being Mexican American, first generation here, and my parents being from Mexico, they had immigrated here in the United States in the 1980s. The term sustainability in college, anyways, was introduced to me, and I was so confused what it meant. And I think
Really?
looking back at it, once I was able to really deconstruct sustainability and what it meant to me, and I made a definition of what I thought sustainability meant to me on my page a few weeks ago, I looked at my parents' culture and I just remember that, of course, being a low income, first generation student in the States, my parents acted on survival, right? Like we didn't really, think of things as being sustainable, right? We just thought of them being resourceful and regenerative, right? My parents we would always go to thrift store clothing, which were like 33 cents each for a piece of clothing because that's what affordability meant for us, right? The second thing was that, I used to help my parents recycle cans around the area, which is like actually going and picking up recycling cans in the recycling bins of your neighborhood. And, for us, it wasn't about oh, we're being eco friendly. It was about this is what our parents taught us too in Mexico, but also too that we don't really have that much to survive with. And I think
Yeah.
for me, I always connected it with survivalhood and how that really, I had this survival mindset of if I wasn't resourceful, if I wasn't being sustainable, quote unquote, then I felt ashamed because I had grown up my whole life, learning that my parents would always, tell me you have to reuse everything. You have to make sure that you don't throw away and discard. And I think they made me challenge my relationship with waste because I think of how it's introduced here in the United States is as a negative thing. And I think it is a negative thing, of course, but if we also create positive relationships with waste and how we're able to be creative with it and how to be able to reuse it properly and sustainably, I think that's what's really most important for me.
Yeah. I mean, I like how you talk a lot about it being like sustainability sort of being like a very fancy term when for you it was, or for your family or for even communities of color in the US, it's just a matter of surviving and making do with
Mhm.
whatever you have, like making it go that little bit extra. Because I remember when I moved to the UK, it's things like going to a charity shop to buy your clothes was like, it was rebranded as vintage shopping, and so that,
Yeah.
that for me was like a very new thing, that these clothes are seen as vintage because there is definitely that aspect of survival that you talked about, but in a country like India, which is like rapidly growing and people are having as they're sort of as they move up from working class to middle class, sort of it's also a matter of aspirational ownership, so where practices like mend and repair were usually and actually are still the norm, but there's still an aspiration of owning new, so it was
Mhm.
also different to just sort of be exposed to a conversation where it's been talked about as something cool or something that now white people do, as bad as that sounds.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to with our traditional practices, right? A lot of our ancestral families practice, circularity, right? And how their relationship with land and the soil and waste was. And I think part of it in the United States is kind of lost. We're not really taught the importance of gardening. I remember the only gardening class I took in elementary was just this one class where we just digged a plot and planted seeds, and that was it. We never returned back to the garden. We didn't talk about the importance of food and soil, and it was even in high school too. We don't even talk about this, which is why in college I was like, why was this never talked about at a young age? Because at a young age, if we develop these positive relationships with the environment and understanding our own values and ethics, it can also change our mindset in the longer term as futures as they get older too.
Yeah, absolutely. And your platform, as the name suggests, it focuses on BIPOC communities, LGBTQ communities.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to sort of get into, like, if you could just talk a little bit about how these communities are disproportionately affected by the climate emergency.
Yeah, I think for us, for me, the reason why I wanted to be highlighting these groups is because, you know, for me, one of the main reasons why I was spurred and created this page and making sure that, and amplifying these voices is mainly because in college I was so excited to study the environment. And then when I entered, there was barely any Black and brown people in my environmental classes. And that made me very concerned of why a lot of Black and brown students weren't studying these majors. And, it was really sad to see that, a lot of us who have come from low income communities, the ones who had met at an early year, we also lacked a lot of resources educational wise. And I think there's this notion where a lot of people in university think like if you're low income, you most likely have scholarships and you're super smart. And, like, of course, there are a lot of super smart people out there, but for me, I wasn't really the smartest in college. I struggled a lot. And I think, because of that perseverance and that hard work ethic I have for myself, I had to persevere. But at the same time, I realized of how toxic it was for my mental health is because, having to battle a lot of professors and challenge their notions of ideals. And like a lot of the professors I had in environmentalism were all white. There was never a single Black, Indigenous people of color or a queer professor I ever had in college. And that really concerned me. And it made me realize, like, if this is the case here, like, isn't it a reflection of what the real world looks like? And, as I got in deeper into doing environmental work, I realized the lack of diversity in these spaces. And, it really made me concerned of how I wanted to enter this field because I had done research too. And that was the same thing where it wasn't really diverse. And a lot of, microaggressions were said about me and I heard it and it really got to me. But of course I couldn't never say anything because I was a research, student. So I didn't want to lose my research. I didn't want to lose my senior thesis. So I think for me, that's what made me understood, but also understanding the environmental justice movement in the 1960s here in the United States, that it really focused on raising awareness between the environment and race, class, and status, and how that really interconnected with environmental racism. And I think for me, that's what really spurred my, anger towards the environmental movement is the fact that, like, while we had a lot of environmentalists talking about the preservation of ecological environments, which is so important. Of course, I understand that they were missing a lot of missing the people in these movements, mainly being Black, Indigenous people of color. And I realized that, like, if I wanted to really provide a platform where it really showcased the injustices that were happening, and I wanted other young folks to look at people like me and other Black, Indigenous people of color environmentalists online to get inspiration that they want to also become an environmentalist or want to learn more about the environment, that they knew that they understand that they're not alone. Because most of the time, speaking with white environmentalists, I could not really make a lot of connections with them and such, or their experiences were mainly like outdoor, which I didn't really have that much outdoor experiences. And I just felt a bit sometimes like confused with myself saying like, am I doing it right? Like, should I have had these experiences that my white environmentalist friends had? And I told myself like, no, that's fine. Everyone comes different. Everyone's unique, right? I think there's this common notion in academia where it perpetuates this sort of type of white environmentalism where Eurocentric views are above a lot of indigenous views, which is something that's very problematic in my view.
Yeah. And did you notice that, actually, before we go on to this question, when you talk about outdoors experience, do you just mean like time spent hiking mountains for leisure? Is that what you specifically refer to?
Yeah, definitely. Like camping or other things like that, or road tripping with friends and stuff like that.
Yeah. I mean, I've only. It's funny that you mentioned that because also when I moved to the UK, I remember like all of my white British friends sort of being like, oh, shall we go camping during the summer? And I was like, if you were back in India, you would just not go camping because you'd probably get stabbed or something. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because there's, first of all, like wilderness is different in India, and whatever little remains and is not sort of grazed down in the face of a big development project is often like unsafe, you know. So it's not something that you do for fun. So that was also a little bit of a culture shock to me, that people just spend time around trees and, you know, without any sort of like security or anything around. So that's quite interesting. And my next question to you was, did you notice, because it's something that I've at least noticed during my time doing the podcast and my startup, did you notice that there were perhaps more women than there were men in any of the courses or the modules that you took?
Yeah, definitely. I think for me, actually, the interesting thing is that there was barely any queer men of color or queer men in general in a lot of the environmental courses I took. But, you know, I think when I was looking at my final major, like in your last 2 years of the college, you take all your operatives, which is related towards the major. And, you know, I barely saw actually any men, but within my own class, there was a evenly distribution of men. But many of the men that were in the environmental science program that I took, a lot of them were very on the research side or PhD or master's side. So it wasn't really them really wanting to get their toes into sustainability or climate change. Is more about like, oh, I have this specific research that I really love, like in microbiology or plants whatsoever, ecology. So it was really interesting to see that dynamic, because for me, I was always like, I don't know what I want to do. But also too, I was like, I know I don't want to get into research. And a lot of my peers that I was with were always women of color. That was like my main friend group that was within the environmental classes.
Yeah. So my time doing this podcast and just looking up people who are entrepreneurs or activists, I've actually come across a lot more women than I have men. And there is actually, like, I dove into this, I did a lot more research on it, and there is actually an equal gender gap within the sustainability sector, so to speak, you know. And just to quote like a couple of stats here, there's a Mintle study that was done in 2018 in the UK, which found that 71% of women tried to live more ethically, quote unquote, as opposed to 59% men. And similarly, in the US, there was a study that found that men don't recycle because they see it as, again, quote unquote, girly. You know, and I mean, I tried to look for research on this in India, but India is not at that stage yet where we are sort of unpacking masculinity, although it is like heavily like chock-a-block full of toxic masculinity, but we're not at a stage where we're unpacking or criticizing or unlearning that. So did you, in your experience while you were studying or as an educator, in your experience, have you faced or observed people sort of reinforce gendered attitudes towards being sustainable?
Yeah, I think I actually made a post a few weeks ago that talked about this. I had a friend that was like, he's straight, of course, he's one of my friends, and he had mentioned like, oh, that's a gay thing. And then I like, it wasn't, of course, angry at him, but I asked like, why is it a gay thing? And, you know, he stayed silent because he couldn't think of anything. And I think sometimes here in the West, especially myself, you know, growing closeted up in my early years, is that like, I realized that like a lot of kids at a younger age always say like, oh, haha, that's gay, to really justify that like something is either like dumb or stupid or like girly, quote unquote. And I think, you know, that stems back to a lot of like, you know, the themes of colonization, right? Where this dominated male figure would be the one to really extract, lead, and like do all these things that perpetuate toxic masculinity. And I think, you know, I can't speak for all cultures, of course, but I think that, you know, that's kind of been the idea, because a lot of indigenous cultures have two-spirit identities where, you know, like gender is fluid and like, you know, sexuality is like fluid too. And I think that like a lot of that has been attempted to be erased or lost. And I think that like the reason why that stems back here in the United States it's because at a young age, we already are becoming a bit binary in the way we teach. So we're saying like, boys don't cry, girls like, care for each other. And we talk about these masculine, feminine energies. And, while it is dangerous sometimes to kind of gender these types of energies, I think the important thing to know is that like when we talk about these energies, it's not necessarily saying that like if you have feminine energy that makes you a female. It's more about these energies kind of make within, right, a person, right? We all share certain types of energy and fluid identities within ourselves. And I think that like, males at a young age or boys at a young age were told like, you don't cry, you don't do this, and you have to make sure you're doing this. And, there's not really a lot of education for consent. That kind of stems back from the failure of education and also from the parents of how, they were taught, because it's just a reflection of what their ancestors taught you, right? Or their older parents or grandparents. And I think too, my father too also did this to me where he's like, you always need to be serious. You need to establish yourself. And it's just like all these very like dominating themes of like extraction come from this idealism.
Yeah. In India as well, I mean, there is a misconception that India is vegetarian/vegan. India is majority meat eating, possibly like around maybe 80%, I think. But we'll have to fact check that. And I think, there's definitely this conversation or this like cultural underpinning of machismo, which is that when it comes to something like having a practice or like a sustainable practice, whether it's recycling or whether it's a habit like being vegan or vegetarian, it's seen as feminine. It's feminized in a derogatory way. So it's like, oh, if you're a real man, you would eat meat, or if you're a real man, you would do X, Y, Z.
Yeah. And I think that like it just, it just stems back from like what was taught at an early age. And I think that if we were able to challenge both the parents and the children's education, I think that this can be a pave way for unlearning and, kind of unlearning this toxic masculinity within boys. Man, I think it is something that's very difficult because, it's stemmed within our own world and capitalism of what it is today,
Yeah. And I wonder then, you talk a bit about, the role that the family atmosphere can play in challenging stereotypes or sort of engendered roles within the household. And I wonder when it comes to marketing certain products, there's also something to be said about the fact that when it comes to products which are biodegradable or products that are eco-friendly, like a laundry detergent or, some cleaning equipment, that's almost always like targeted more towards women because they're still doing the lion's share of care work within homes.
Yeah, and definitely. And I think that's a really great point you pointed out. And I think a lot of these eco-friendly pages do this that sell products. One is because, like you were saying, like it kind of that implies or reinforces the idea that they're the ones who are constantly cleaning. But two, of course, they understand too, from a market business perspective, that most of their clients are females. So they're more inclined to cater the product towards women because the lack of men in sustainable and interest in products hasn't really risen on that side. So for them, it doesn't very seem as a viable option to try to market it within men. And I think that like there's a lot of issues, of course, and of course I don't want to place the whole blame on the brand because that's also, but I think raising awareness on this type of issue of like, a lot of like, I think some men now, millennials like me, like they want to take care of themselves, right? They want to take care of their outfits. They want to take care of their own style, their hair. And I think that this needs to be reinforced and incorporated within it. And I think that there can be a little shift and change from the brand's side of where, they introduce a lot of like products for men in a sense of like the same products that are advertised are for like, of course, like females. But I think that like, having that representation in those photos or talked about it more by men, I think that could really be a step towards, helping the sustainable movement.
Yeah, no, definitely. And on your platform on Instagram, for instance, have you noticed that there are guys who are sort of open to engaging with the material and like putting in the effort to unlearning some of the toxic masculine narratives or traits that they might have internalized?
I think there are a few men I actually do follow back on Instagram. Those are the ones who are A/queer already, or two, they really grew up in families that didn't perpetuate toxic masculinity. So for them, like, they're very open in expressing their masculine and feminine energies and like really expressing themselves. And, even though they identify as straight, and I think, some of them, the ones I've had conversations with, have been really open to me and very nice to me, But at the same time, it does concern me that a lot of times in the content of my posts that really try to challenge men, I get like zero responses from men most of the times. And most of the times, the ones who are, responding are either females or people who are non-binary femmes. So it's like, to me, it makes me question like why they don't want to engage. And I think my follower ratio too, it's like very low. Where only like I think 10 to 14% of my followers are male identifying, and the rest are female identifying based on Instagram identities, the data.
Yeah. And I'm curious to know when you're putting yourself out there. I mean, we talked a little bit about mental health, as a person of color, as a person who identifies as queer. We talked a little bit about that. But putting yourself out on Instagram, putting in the effort to create all of this content, it can definitely get quite overwhelming, because I think after a certain point, what happens is that people sort of come to you to comment on any and whatever issue that pops up, so it's like you're then sort of seen as somebody who's expected to comment, somebody who's expected to create material around whatever the latest current affair is, whatever current issues are going on. And I wanted to know, how do you sort of take care of yourself and find the boundary between engaging and then taking time out for yourself?
Yeah, I think for me, like, this is why I think I'm glad I created this page a few 6 months ago, because Olivia Magazine, when I am no longer the co-creator, as I stepped down to work on my page. But when me and my co-founder were working on the account, like, we saw that it was a lot of work, and I think that like I gained a lot of experience of how to be quote unquote mature on that side, and also myself as a person. I gave myself a lot of time to develop myself and grow myself. Like, after my horrible relationship I had in college, like, I took years off of dating because I really wanted to really focus on myself and invest myself and really unlearn a lot of the toxic things that I own perpetuated myself. And I think that like, it reflects back on my page in the sense of like my tone of voice of what I will respond to people. But I also, always want people to understand that like in my followers too, that like at the end of the day, like a lot of people are always like, oh, I'm so inspired by your page. Like, I want to do this, but I don't want to make it seem like I'm copying you. I always tell people like I'm never want to be the face of environmental education terms or
Yeah.
slash, like the one who created this. And I'm the only one who can be talking about this, because then at the end of the day, like, my main purpose for this page was to create environmental awareness. It was never to be like, oh, you should follow me, like I do this. And it's more like, oh yeah, I run a very small page where I talk about this because that's my passion, right? And this is something I enjoy. So I think for me, it's having that boundary between like, of course, my passion and love for it, and also the other boundary where it's like, if I need to distance myself from social media, and establish boundaries where I have to tell people no, in a quote unquote nice way, or just in a respectful way, to be like, hey, like, I don't have the capacity right now to work with you. As I've gotten growing more and more, I've been getting more requests like that. And it does concern me in the future where, I don't really ask people ever to pay me, of course, but it concerns me in the future where, I don't want to be always expected of like providing free, in-depth, more resources for people if they want to DM me about certain questions.
we've talked a little bit about unlearning, and I just wanted to know what that process of unlearning certain tenets of what it means to be a man, such as, men don't cry. What did that process look like for you?
I think it was a bit traumatic, I think, for me in the beginning, because I had grown up in an environment where, my father was very homophobic towards me and not really accepting towards me. And, it kind of almost placed guilt on me. And I think that, like, during that time in college when I was actually alone and was able to really discover myself, find a lot of supportive systems out there, I think it made me realize that, I wasn't alone, because a lot of the queer community there had also experienced similar things like me, people of color. And I think that, like, as I've gotten older, it really makes me happy that mainly most of the guy friends that I'm with, whether they be queer or, straight, a lot of them are very accepting and understanding and really, really toward having positive male relationships, such as, like, not perpetuating this toxic masculinity. And I think, for a lot of us, for myself anyways, I speak on that, is that unlearning takes years, days, or months for certain people. But I think the first step is towards addressing the issue within yourself, right? That there's something wrong, and that's okay if something's wrong. But I think that, like, if you have the power to address that, that means that you have the power to actually begin unlearning that and really educating males in your own circles, because I think a lot of the times the burden is placed on the woman to teach the man, when in reality it's like, even myself as a male person, like, I still take responsibility in trying to, like, challenge men, because it's very frustrating. But of course too, there's another barrier within myself with certain men where they're like, they're straight and I'm like queer, so it's about, like, choosing my own narratives and my own battles that I would want to challenge people with.
Yeah, I think that's such a pertinent point where you said that the onus of, explaining certain things, or sort of even explaining why something is wrong almost falls on women, or people who have all of this privilege don't seem to actually want to, like, use it to Google things and unlearn certain attitudes for themselves. I'd almost expect somebody else to do the emotional labor, because, speaking from my own experience, bearing in mind that I'm straight, whenever I've been in relationships with men, what's almost happened is that, there will be, like, either they will not understand the issue at all, or, like, they won't understand why it's important, or worse, arguably, they'll try and play devil's advocate. Do you know what I mean? So they'll just, so if I tell them that, okay, this is an issue, or, for example, rape anxiety, right? So I say rape anxiety is a very real issue, and I have it, and this is what it means, or this is what it's about. And they'll be like, yeah, but, what if the guy is just wanting to go back home and is taking a shortcut and is hence behind you? And it's just so frustrating when they do that, because it's like, you don't even have to like go onto Google and understand rape anxiety in all of its depth. You can just start off by listening.
Yeah, and like you were mentioning too, it's like women have the right to, of course, be a little bit, of course, like, nervous or, like, kind of sketched out because of past experiences and trauma. I think I remember too, like, once, like, walking in the woods in university, and there a woman was in front of me, but she kept looking back, and of course, like, I didn't take it personal, because I feel like her past experiences have been something like that, have been, like, kind of unsafe for her. So for me, of course, in the dark, I just went a different pathway just to ensure that, like, they didn't have to go through this, like, weird or / traumatic anxiety too, because that's kind of, like, of course, scary for them too.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that, like, I think all women can possibly attest to, which is, you grow up with these certain safety rules and regulations, which is, like, all about how you can safeguard yourself, and whether it's, like, I mean, I remember from a very young age, things like my mom would be like, okay, if you're by yourself and you're in the elevator, then make sure that you're not with just one other man, that there are, like, a few people. And if there is just only one man in the elevator, before you get on, don't get on, so just things like that, where, and this is, like, when you're exposed to this kind of safeguarding conversation and this narrative where, your safety is your responsibility, but men don't have an equivalent of your actions will have consequences. And I mean, sort of you are there to go through that, and there's no culpability on men. I think there's a very disproportionate message. There's a huge discrepancy between what we're teaching girls and what we're teaching guys then.
Yep, definitely. And I agree that too. It needs to be addressed, and it also needs to be addressed within older, like as men get older too, or boys get older, like, you know, this is something that's real and something that you need, that boys themselves need to address themselves of how they're perpetuating it. And if so, they need to unlearn it and call themselves in as a community of, you know, quote unquote bros, right? Like they always say that, but you know, as bros, do they really hold themselves accountable for a lot of their problematic, you know, bros that are out there, you know?
Yeah. And I wonder then, to bring it back to the work that you do within climate education, what is the role of these deeply embedded ideas of masculinity and misogyny in climate denial, for instance?
Yeah, I think for me, like, it's just making those interconnections that at the end of the day, this is linked towards white supremacy, right? I think that a lot of people are always like, what? Like white supremacy? Like never. Or they're like, what do you mean? And I think that, like, if we look into the climate crisis right now, like, I ask people, like, why do you think it was created today? And people are like, well, the fossil fuel industry. But I was like, okay, but who created this system of wealth for capital, and who decentralized a lot of countries' powers of their own economics and their own traditions of how they kind of resource food? Like, the reason why we're in this is because colonialism, environmental colonialism that was created today, is seen as it's a very unsustainable model. And I think that, like, it's the reflection of what's happening today. And I think that, like, a lot of people, it's hard for them to make these interconnections, or slash two, they just want to be ignorant or they just want to deny it. But I think that, like, by addressing this, it really opens the eyes for others that, like, you know, this is something that's a systematic issue. It's not just a linear issue, right? Like, when we look at the web of, like, the issues of what the system serves for who and to whom they serve to, you'll realize that everything's going to be stemmed back towards colonialism, which is linked towards white supremacy. So, you know, looking at that, you then realize that, like, of course, there's a lot of issues in the environmental movement. And I think for me, I try to bring that perspective. But of course, too, you know, my education levels is geared towards those who are in high school / like older, because I think that, like, kids at a younger age, not that they are not making those connections, but, you know, their education of wherever they may be different exposures of environmental education.
Yeah. And also, you know, you want to start having those conversations with kids sort of earlier on.
Yeah.
Which is, I think, very instrumental. And you know, it's such a good point what you're talking about, where there is definitely, like, this sort of nexus, or like this triumvirate of capitalism, white supremacy, you know, and the patriarchy. Because, I mean, this is quite a popular example, which was Greta Thunberg's. So this Canadian oil and gas company circulated this vile cartoon of Greta Thunberg, who's a very well-known activist, being sexually assaulted, you know, and when they were confronted and they were pulled up about this, their response was, you know, like, she's not a child, she's 17 years old. And then that's just despicable.
Yep, definitely. Very disrespectful. And it just goes to show to you that, like, the industries of what works, and these people are usually white, are willing to go to the length to, of course, sacrifice or, like, discard children. And if it makes you think that, like, you know, what they did to her, like, we're seeing, like, what they're doing towards Black Indigenous people of color. Like, they're destroying them and killing them and murdering them for them trying to protect their own lands from development, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, there's a lot of data and there's a lot of research done on this, you know, of like just how many Indigenous women have, you know, been brutally assaulted and murdered, and how they're sort of like the worst affected by these extractivism and, you know, pro oil, gas, fossil fuel industries, and then also at the hands of, you know, physical violence.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. And I think that like you mentioned too, like I think it needs to be addressed in the environmental movements that a lot of indigenous women, are at the front line of these communities demanding for environmental justice. And they are the ones that have the highest rate of missing. And a lot of the violence that is occurred to Native women, they're found by non-Native people, right? So it's people from the outside that are coming to harm these women. And also, if you look into it, like, why is it that they have the highest rate of they're going missing? Like, there must be links towards what the government is doing, or what, exactly are they trying to do? Because they understand that Indigenous women have a very special, deep relationship with the environment, and they have protected the environment for decades. And, I think for them, it's attempting to, of course, erase their culture and their own power within.
Yeah. And, now there is definitely hope, because you do have movements like Extinction Rebellion and 350.org and Fridays for Future. And you've got all of these young activists across the world who are taking climate justice and climate action sort of to acquire or to get climate justice into their own hands. And I just wanted your thoughts on how Extinction Rebellion, by their own admission, is still quite like a movement that is centered or that is grounded in the global north. So I just wanted to know what you think they can do, or movements like Extinction Rebellion can do, to make their movement more diverse and more inclusive.
Yeah, I mean, I think that like a lot of these movements, youth movements too, that I've created, I think one thing is that I acknowledge all of the work they're doing, right? Because I think that like doing that type of activism can be mentally draining and straining. But I think that like, of course, like there's always disagreements between communities, right? And I think that the best thing to do for me, especially since I'm not in these orgs and I can't always speak on behalf, is understanding the interconnections of a lot of environmental issues, and understanding that everything is always interconnected, right? And I think that like, Extinction Rebellion's doing their best to understand that. And I think that like, they're really working towards creating a stronger relationship with Indigenous communities to ensure that they're meeting their needs, and understanding that these people are the ones who are being represented, because at the end of the day, a lot of the, people who are marching in these protests, while of course some of them are of course already experiencing environmental racism or injustices, most of the people at the end of the day go back home to their homes and, they're fine, right? But I think that like, where the climate crisis is happening is in different parts of the country where they need immediate attention now, or they need help now, or their communities are being murdered. So I think that like, is it so important that like, of course they continue doing this, not to say that they don't, of course, because I do feel that they do. And I would pretty assume that they're aware of this, a lot of the environmental movements, and just to ensure that there's more diversity too, of course, in these movements, which I think they have been noting. And of course, a lot of the orgs always have this issue too, within even like 350 and stuff like that.
Yeah. And I think finally, I want to ask, how do you want men to show up in the fight for climate justice? And whether you have any like tips or resources that they can sort of get started on.
Yeah, I mean, I think that like one is just like educating yourself on your own privileges when you enter spaces, right? I think that a lot of times, sometimes men are going to be like, oh, I'm going to speak out and like protect everyone, right? But I think that like, it's like, addressing who you can challenge, addressing where the issue, addressing, making sure and ensuring that people's safety is not at risk or is going to be compromised. And I think like educating yourself as a male individual, like where your role is in the environmental movement. And like, I think that like a lot of times, sometimes men in environmental movements can be like, oh, like, I'll take control of this, I'll do this. And like, just like directly doing it. But I think that like, it's about collectivism, right? Not individualistic behaviors or mindset of like what you need to do, right? It's a collective community. So I think that like entering these spaces within climate justice, wherever you may be, is understanding that like you also have the power to make change, but you have the power to make change together, right? So I think that like remembering that when entering spaces is so important.
Yeah. And do you have, any books or like podcast recommendations, barring our own episode, of course, but just sort of general, like your own page, for instance, that people can sort of finish listening to this episode to and then rush to to busy themselves in during this lockdown.
Yeah, definitely your podcast, of course. I actually, yeah, it's so awesome. I actually always encourage a lot of environmentalists out there to, if they are Western focused, to really go out there and understand a lot of the issues happening outside of the United States and the UK, educate themselves on the environmental movement happening out there and with all the climate crisis. I think one of my favorite podcasters is Breaking Green Ceilings, Safna. She actually recently interviewed me a few months ago, actually, about being queer, and like my kind of talks about my historical information of what I did in the climate movement. But I think that she does a really great job in explaining a lot of the historical timelines of what's happening in Kenya and the environmental movement, especially because she's originally from Kenya. So I think just honoring the fact that like listening to a lot of these pages is really empowering. Another page I really encourage that is the Black Indigenous People of Color Environmentalist is my favorite best friend, Brown Girl _Green. She is a brown Filipina environmental activist that has done a lot of climate change work, and she's really awesome and really talks to a lot of experiences of what it means for her being a brown woman in the environmental movement. So definitely really encourage people that, if they're going to be diversifying their own feed, to really encourage themselves to really learn more of why they're diversifying it, but also understanding that these are all people, right? So being very respectful of them too.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much, Isaias, for taking time out. I know it's very early there in New York, and I know you haven't had your breakfast or your coffee or anything else, and you've gotten straight onto this episode. So I'm so happy that you found time for this. And thank you so much for being on this episode.
Yeah, thank you so much. And feel free to let me know whenever it's posted in the future, and more than happy to share that, of course.
I will link your account, your social media account, your website, and the other resources that you mentioned in the little blurb about our podcast episode so that it's easily accessible and navigable or navigationable, whatever you call it, on the for our listeners. So thank you very much. And that marks the end of this week's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. You can find all the relevant links and handles to know more about our guest this week in the episode description. If you have any feedback, suggestions, requests, or simply just want to get in touch with us, then please do head over to our podcast website. We are available to flag and say hi to via Facebook, Instagram, or email. Thank you, and see you next week.